Welcome to Solms-Delta. This is our range of wines. We're now making 9 wines, which is more than enough. I assure you, this is our full range. We're not making any more. The defining feature of our wine is that we're trying very hard to make uniquely South African styles. That may come as a surprise to hear that in a country where wine has been made for 350 years, we're still trying to evolve our own unique style. But in fact, that is quite, it's something that's happening in this country in general in the post-apartheid period. So much has changed, so much changed in the world of wine during the apartheid period, and South Africa is completely reinventing itself in every sphere, not only socially and politically, but also in terms of our wines. So although on this farm we've made wine for 320 years, it's really only over the last 10 years or less that this range of wines has been available. What we're trying to do is make the most of local conditions, local soil, local climate, local social conditions, to make wine that you can't make anywhere else as well as we can make it here. That is to say, we're trying to make the best wine in the world that you can make in South Africa. This range of 9 wines has within it 3 major themes, which are the embodiment of this effort to make uniquely South African wine. The first theme is, because we've made wine in this country for 350 years, we have obviously learned a thing or two about what does well here. It's been pretty much by accident, because the original grape varietals that were brought here, first by the Dutch in the 1650s, and then by the French Huguenots in the 1690s, the varietals that they brought weren't brought with any scientific consideration of, are these going to be the best wine grape varietals for South Africa? The Dutch, I don't know whether there was any thought at all as to which varietals they brought. They didn't even seem to know what the names of the varietals were. And so it took us some time to discover in recent times, what in fact these classical South African varietals are with DNA analysis. The French Huguenots clearly planted and made wines according to how they did it in the old country. And one can understand they were nostalgic and they were homesick, but that's not a basis for making scientific decisions. So although some of those varietals that the French Huguenots and the Dutch brought have proven to do really well here, they've stood the test of time, most have not. Those few that have, those we've incorporated into our range. More generally though, we've relied upon, and this is the second major theme running through our wines, we've relied upon Mediterranean varietals. And that's for the simple reason that this valley, the Franschhoek Valley, which is so named, as it happens, after the French Huguenots who came here in the 1690s. Franschhoek means French quarter. This valley is hot, dry, windy. In a word, it's a Mediterranean climate. And our soils, as it happens, are also southern Rhone-like. The rocky soils of our farm are reminiscent of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So what we've done is concentrated on Rhone varietals and on Mediterranean varietals more generally, because they are best suited to the soil conditions of this region. So we're combining these 2 themes, tried and tested South African classics with a new wave of focusing upon Mediterranean varietals more suited to the climatic and soil conditions of our region. The third theme that characterizes our wines is probably their most unique feature. When I say that we're using Mediterranean varietals, one thinks nowadays of the wines of the Rhone region of France and of course the great Italian wines and so on. But what we forget is that winemaking excellence didn't begin in that part of the world, and certainly didn't begin in France. Winemaking excellence actually began in the ancient world. In biblical times, in the Old Testament, you find frequent references to wine. And that is, of course, because wine was being made those days. Probably the first pinnacle of winemaking excellence was in the ancient Greek Empire. And if you read ancient Greek winemaking texts, and let's not forget the Greeks really knew how to enjoy life. If you read ancient Greek winemaking texts, you find frequent reference to a way of making wine that seemed those days to be generally recognized as the way to make really good wine. What they did was, when the grapes ripen, just as they get ripe, you crush the stem of the bunch, thereby physiologically disconnecting the bunch from the vine. So although the bunch is still hanging there, it's physically disconnected except by fibers. So it's hanging from the fibers, but there's no communication, no biological communication between the grapes and the vine. So you've effectively harvested them, but they're still hanging in the vine. What that does, if you leave them hanging for a few weeks, as we do, is that the grapes dehydrate. So you have a higher ratio of skin to juice, which makes for more concentrated flavors, and it also makes for more intense color. But probably the best underlying reason to do this is that it helps with that perennial conflict in harvesting between whether you should harvest early for good acidity or harvest late for good ripeness. The problem is, if you harvest late, you get good ripeness, but you get low acidity and jammy wines. If you harvest early, you get good acidity, but you get the green, unripe flavors. So what this method that the ancients happened upon thousands of years ago does is that it enables you to have literally the best of both worlds. You have good acidity, therefore long-lived wines, but you also have full ripeness. Just to recap, the themes that run through our wines, we are trying to reinvent South African wine, to make uniquely South African wine, to make the best wine that you can make in this place. And the way that we're doing it is combining three themes. One of them is using tried and tested South African classical varietals that have stood the test of time. The second is using Mediterranean varietals, which are suited to our climatic and soil conditions. Particularly, we use Rhone, southern French varietals. And the third theme is going back to this ancient Greek practice of desiccation of grapes on the vine. That practice was lost when winemaking excellence disappeared with the collapse of the Roman Empire, because the ancient Romans did this too. When winemaking excellence re-emerged in the Middle Ages in France, the climatic conditions were not suited. You need to have dry, hot, windy conditions to use that ancient Greek method. One last thing to say about our range as a whole is that many of our wines are blends, not single varietals. Blending is a fine art. The reason that we blend is basically twofold. The one is that every grape varietal has its strengths and its weaknesses. If you make a single varietal wine, you're at the mercy of that varietal's strengths and weaknesses. Now, of course, that makes it easier to market, because people know, I like Viognier, I like Cabernet Sauvignon, I like Sauvignon Blanc, etc. So they recognize it easily on the shelf. But the reason why in the classical winemaking traditions wines are blended is because each grape has strengths and weaknesses. And if you offset the weakness of a grape with the strength of another grape, you just make higher quality wines. It's sort of obvious. If you make dinner with one ingredient, it's going to have a less satisfying overall flavor profile than if you make it with 3 or 4 ingredients. Exactly the same applies to wine. The second reason for relying on blends is that every vintage is different. Every year is different weather-wise. And so if in a particular year, a particular late ripening varietal didn't ripen properly, then you can offset that in your blend with an earlier ripening varietal that year did well. So it allows for a more consistent quality from vintage to vintage by making blends.